Today's daf is daf Chav Dalid, and we'll begin on the top line, V'nicham Sham. The Torah says that when the Kohen Gadol finishes his avoda on Yom Kippurim, he must place his bgadim sham. What is that teaching us? Malamed shetu'unim gniza. It teaches us that he has to bury them. In other words, the implication here is, until we see Rabbi Dosa's opinion, that these begadim that were used by the Kohen Gadol, even though he might, theoretically, he could have bequeathed them to a Kohen Hedjel, to the same four begadim, his big day love on, but no, Inichem Sham, they require gniza. They cannot be used, and we're going to soon see a machlokas about this, by the Kohen Hedjot subsequent to Yom Kippurim, they have to be buried. However, who disagrees? Rabbi Dosa. And he's of the opinion, Ru'uyim Heim LeKohen Hedjot, we can actually leave them for a regular Kohen. And Rabbi Dosa is assuming that the Avneit of the Kohen Gadol, when he went to Tnai V'Lifnim, was identical to the Avneit of the Kohen Hedjot, which means it had a mixture of linen and wool. So what is the Torah implying here? That to some extent there is some sort of quasi geniza, and that the big day kahuna of the Kohen Gadol should be placed away and not used. That as far as the Kohen Gadol is concerned, he is not going to be able to use those begadim 365 days from now for the next Yom Kippur. But as far as the Kohen Hedjot is concerned, he can. He's allowed, according to Rabbi Dosa. Now the Tanakama here is identified as Rabbi Yehuda. My lav bahaka miflegi. Shouldn't we assume that this machlokas here, recorded in this brisa, between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Dosa, is simply at the root of it identical with the machlokas between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan? My lab bahaka miflegi. Demar savar avodahi, umar savar lav avodahi. That Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion, reflecting the shita of Rabbi Yochanan, that Haramas Hadeshen is considered an avodah. And the opinion of Rabbi Dosa would seem to reflect the shita of Reish Lakish, that Hotzas Hadeshen is not an avodah. In other words, what the Gemara is doing is it's going back to the extra pasuk Yilbash. And Rabbi Dosa uses that word Yilbash to teach us that the Hotzas Hadeshen is not considered an avodah, and that's why it doesn't require all the big day kahuna. So the Gemara now immediately rejects this. Lo, the Kuli Alma Avodi. Both Rabbi Yehuda and even Rabbi Dosa agree that Hotzas Hadesh, that Haramas Hadeshen, like Rabbi Yochanan, is an avodah. For Hacha, B'Hacha Miflegi. Here the argument is as follows: Mar Savar, according to Rabbi Yehuda, Tzricha Kroy L'Rabuye. We need the extra word Yilbash, because in the absence of that extra drasha, Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that maybe we'd have a Havamina, that it's enough for the Kohen at the time of Haramas Hadeshen to wear 2 out of the 4 begadim, because only 2 out of the 4 begadim are mentioned in the pasuk. When the Torah adds the word Yilbash, it's coming to tell you that you need all 4 begadim. But now what we're saying is that even Rabbi Dosa agrees that according to this answer, the Gemara, that the Hotzas Hadeshen, I'm sorry, I keep making that mistake. Leave out Hotzas Hadeshen. We'll get to that later. And Haramas Hadeshen is an avoda, but he maintains that there's no need for the Torah to have to tell me that you need all 4 begotten. Every avoda of any Kohen requires 4 begotten. So why did the Torah add the word Nilbash? That's for a different drasha to teach me that the Kohen Hedjot is allowed to wear the big day Kohen Gadol after Yom Kippur. Boy, Rabbi Ovin, Trumas Hadeshen Bekama. What's the shear? How much of the deshen, of the ashes, does he have to remove from the Mizbeach in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Trumas Hadeshen? And the Gemara now analyzes Rabbi Ovin's suffix. Mitrumas Maser Yalfinan Le. Shall we compare Trumas Hadeshen to Trumas Maser, which would require 1/10, and after you give Meiser to the Levi is Chayav in Trumas Maser, and the Torah uses the same exact language of Varimosem. And Varimosem in Trumas Maser means that the Levi has to give 1/10 of his 1/10 of the Maser that he received to the Kohen. And therefore, since the same word is used here in the context of Haramas Hadeshen, here in Vayikra Perek Vav, it says Veherim, we should make that equation. Or, says the Gemara, maybe Mitrumas Midyan Yalfinan La. Perhaps we should open up the parsha of Trumas Midyan. When the Jewish people fought a battle against Midyan in Bamidbar Perek Chaf, Perek Lamed Aleph, following the terrible Magefa, they took shalol, they took spoils, and the Torah commanded Bnei Yisrael that the soldiers who took those spoils would have to dedicate some of that to the people of Israel. They would have to separate from the spoils a certain amount, and there the Torah uses the same word, Veharimosa, and the Torah specifies that it's 1/500th. So therefore, if we equate this Vaherim with this Vaharimosa, then we come to the conclusion that the shear of Trumas Hadeshen is 1/500. Tashma, now the Gemara quotes a Brisa Rabbi Chia with an entirely different answer to this question, so to speak, from left field. Nemar Khan, here in the parsha of Trumas Hadeshen, the Torah used the word Veherim, as we said in Vayikra Perek Vav. V'nemar lahalon, and now we're going over to the parsha of Menachos. The parsha of Menachos is also in Vayikra Perek Vav. So we're just fast forwarding 5 psukim, and the Torah says that the main avoda of the Kohen, of a Korban Mincha, is what we call kmitza, in which he takes 3 fingers and dips them into the soles, into the flour, and whatever he could grab, he drops, and that's going to be burnt on the Mizbeach. That's called kmitza, that's the kometz. So too, Malahalon, Bekumto, Afkan Bekumto, here too, with regard to Rabbi Oven's question regarding the minimum shear of Trumas Hadeshen, the same word is used that's used in the context of the Korban Mincha, where the Kohen requires a kometz. Here too, the Kohen who's doing the Trumas Hadeshen will require to take off a kometz's worth. Now, we have to be careful over here. We're not talking about the same identical pu'ula that's done in a mincha. I mean, there in a soles of mincha, we can anticipate that the Kohen will dip his fingers directly into the soles and do the kmitza. That can't be possible with regard to the afer, to the ashes of the deshen that are on the mizbeach. I mean, that he'll burn his fingers off. But what it means is he takes a kli and he's Mishayir, he estimates how much would be Malo Kumtzo, how much would of the Deshen would be a volume equal to his komets. Amar Rav, now we get to the main sugya for today. A machlokes between Rav and Levi. And I wish I had more time for this sugya. It's a really profound sugya. I mean, I only had enough time to just put it together on a simple level. This is one of those occasions where the Daf Yomi stimulates your appetite to really want to do more of an in-depth analysis. Amar Rav, Arba Avodos Zar Chayev Aleim Misa. Now let's make a few points here. First of all, we're not talking about Misa's Bezdin. If a Zar usurps the Avoda of a Kohen, he's Chayev Misa B'dei Shamayim. And now Rav wants to tell us what qualifies as an avoda such that the non-Kohen, the Zar, will be chayav misa b'dei shamayim if he does that avoda. And we'll see that Rav has a list of 4 avodos. That's the exhaustive list of avodos that generate chayav misa b'dei shamayim in the case of a Zar. And what's common to all these 4 avodos are 2 conditions that have to be met. So just write that down in your brain. We're going to look for the 2 conditions that, according to Rav, must be met in order to qualify as the avoda, which, if usurped by the Kohen Hedjot, by a Zar, he will be chayav misa b'dei shamayim. But what are the 4 avodos? Number 1, zrika. And keep in mind that zrika is done on the mizbech. Number 2, it is the culmination of all 4 avodos of shchita, kabbalas adam, holachas adam, ending in zrika. Number 2, haktara. What we do is we take those parts of the animal, of the zevach, and we'll see how this applies to birds as well. And we put it on the H of the mizbech to burn it. The very moment the Kohen puts it on the H, he has culminated the mitzvah of Haktorah Sakarban al Gabi Mizbech. If the Zar would usurp that action, he's Chayav Misa B'dei Shamayim. Next, we have Nisuach Hamayim. Now we're talking about Chag HaSukkos on a daily basis. Connection with the Talmud Shel Shachar. There was a Shavta Mayim B'Sason. They took Mayim for the Meshiloach, and they poured it on the Mizbeach. That too is an avoda which requires a Kohen, and if the non-Kohen, the Zar, implements that avoda, he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim. And finally, in the list of 4, the last one on Rav's list is nisuch hayayin, which means to take the yayin as an accompaniment to a karban shlamim or a karban olam. Not generally speaking to a karban chatas. I mean, although there may be exceptions in the case of a mitzorah, but you'd have to know Masechet Menachos for that. In any event, in the cases of shlamim and ola, these karbanos have to be accompanied by niskei yayin, and the nesach, the nisuach on the mizbeach is. On the Mizbeach, it's a concluding avoda, it clinches the avoda, and therefore, if a non-Kohen usurps that avoda, he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim. However, now we have the dissenting view of Levi, who adds a 5th category. Levi Amar Af Trumas Deshen. If a non-Kohen separates the Deshen from the Mizbeach, we'll see which Mizbeach, then he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim, which means that Levi upgrades the status of Trumas HaDeshen to that of a full-fledged avoda that requires a Kohen. It's considered as an avoda on the Mizbeach because the Deshen is on the Mizbeach, is being removed from the Mizbeach, And it's a complete malacha, a complete avodah unto itself. And Levi now has a brisa of Tanoim that he received. V'chein Tani Levi Masnise, he had his brisa, and it says, Af Trumas Adeshen. My time in the Rav. What are the two conditions that have to be met in order for the Zar to be Chayiv Misa? What defines the avodah that generates the Chayiv Misa? There are two conditions. And they are derived from the pasuk. Okay, so here I have to apologize. I must take out my chumash because if you don't see it inside, we're going to turn Perek Chaf, I believe it is. Let's see if I'm right. It's a Parshas Korach. It can't be Perek Chaf. So that's a mistake. Perek Yud Ches. Whole bunch of dinim and kosher we derive from Parshas Korach. And the Torah says the following. I keep in mind that Korach tried to usurp kahuna. So a lot of the laws of the Kohanim are given here in Parshas Korach in the aftermath of his rebellion. So I don't know if you happen to have this big blue chumash, Avisha Chumshei Torah, it's on page 383, but otherwise it's Parshas Korach, Bamidbar Yud Ches, Pasuk Zayin. V'ata uvanecha itcha, tishmeru es kunaschem, l'chol dvar hamizbeach. So you notice that the Torah is telling the Kohanim that this is their specific area. This is their dominion. Tishmeru es kunaschem. This is your special kahuna. L'chol dvar hamizbeach. Okay. So number one, let's underline the word mizbeach. Again, the phrase l'chol dvar is very superfluous. We'll see about that. And then it says ulimi beis la parocha. It's a very complex phrase, but basically we're talking about the Kodesh Kadoshim. And then, just to complicate matters, the Torah repeats the word v'avadetem, which is totally redundant. And then the next phrase, which defines the avodah here, is called avodas matana. And then it says, Vazar hakorev yumos. If this avodah, which is described here in this pasuk, is stolen by the non-Kohen, by the Zar, then he's chayev misa mini misa b'nei shamayim. And basically, the various nuances and phrases in this pasuk, and even letters in this pasuk, are going to be the subject of this entire sugya of Rav and Levi. Rav holds, again, I'm not going to repeat the pasuk because we read the pasuk from the Chumash itself, that the two conditions for Hazar HaKarev Yumos are written in this pasuk. Number one, avodas matana. What does that mean? Avodas matana. And the truth is, I know the answer to this question from a Mishnah. It's very strange that you use a Mishnah to interpret the pasuk in Chumash. But the Mishnah tells us that there's something called matan damin, or shtayim sheim arba, two matanos. So matana means something that's given to the mizbeah, the law of avodas siluk, and it's coming to exclude Trumas Hadeshen, because the Trumas Hadeshen, you're not adding anything to the Mizbeach. On the contrary, you're taking something out of the Mizbeach, off the Mizbeach. That's called Siluk, L'salek es Hadeshen mea Mizbeach. Next, what's the second condition? V'avadetem. We said that word is completely superfluous, so we're going to cut it in half. Avoda tama. You take the ayin beis dalet, separated from the tuf mem, and you get an avoda tama. What is an avoda tama? Avoda tama means a complete avoda. Complete meaning there's nothing that comes after it. And now let's check out the 4 avodos that are on the list of Rav, of which Zaris Chayav Misa. We've got Zrika, it's on the Mizbeach. It's the last avoda, there's nothing after it. We have Haktorah, the last avoda on the Mizbeach, and so too Nisuch HaMayim v'Nisuch HaYayin. All the 4 comply with these conditions, the 2 conditions of number 1, avodas matana, and number 2, avodah tama, to the exclusion of an avodah siluk or to an avodah that is part of a process and requires a hemshech. However, Trumas Hadeshen doesn't fit the bill because Trumas Hadeshen is not an avodas matana. It's an avodah siluk. You might qualify under avodah tama because after you take out the deshen, there's no subsequent avoda. It's a concluding avoda, but it's not an avodas matana. It's an avoda siluk. And avoda tama v'lo avoda sheyesh achreya avoda. So let's take, for example, kabbalas hadam or holachas hadam. The Kohen Hedjo will not be chayav misa if he does that, because that is not an avoda tama. She'ein achreya avoda, it's yesh achreya avoda. And if it's yesh achreya avoda, then it doesn't comply with the second condition. And Trumas Hadeshen doesn't comply with the first condition of avodas matana because it's an avoda siluk. Ad kan shitas ra. Levi seems to assume that the arguments of Rav per se and the way he interprets the pasuk are very cogent, but there are some extra words in the parsha, in this pasuk. Again, we're only learning 1 verse that have to be understood. And again, we go back to the Chumash, and the Chumash says here, in Pasuk Zion, it says, Lechol Dvar HaMizbeach. What's Lechol Dvar? Could have said Dvar HaMizbeach. It could have left out the entire phrase. Kol Dvar HaMizbeach. Says Levi, Rabbi, Rachmana. There's a ribui here in the Pasuk. Lechol Dvar HaMizbeach. Anything that's related to the Mizbeach. And what does that mean? Anything that's related to the Mizbeach, even something that's not an avodas matana, but rather an avodas siluk. And the Torah is making an exception here and including Trumas Hadeshen in the Chiyuv Misa of a Kohen Hedjo. Oh, excuse me, I just made it simple. Of a Zar. Now, the Gemara later on is going to try to figure out, according to Levi, because he basically fundamentally is on board with Rav, that when the Torah says avodas matana, it definitely excludes an avodas siluk. But we have a ribui to include Trumas Hadeshen. Trumas Hadeshen. Why Trumas Hadeshen? That's something that we'll have to understand. Maybe we could use the ribui for other possibilities. Of siluk. For Rav, now the Gemara turns to the tables on Rav. What is he going to do with that pasuk lechol dvar, which is extra? Ahul asuye sheva azos shebi mifnim v'shebi mitzora. Now, what's going on here is that there are categories of avoda that are avodas dam, but not on the mizbeach, or what we call an avodah with shemen in the case of mitzorah. So let's go step by step. First, we have sheva hazos she bifnim. And now we're talking about what's called a chatos pnimis. There are 5 subcategories of a chatos pnimis. And these are called chatos pnimius because the dam, the avodas hadam, is not in the azara, but rather in the echal. That's called bifnim. And they are par kohen Mashiach, par helim dover shel tzibur, seir avoda zara, par v'sar shel Yoma Kippur. So we have 5 categories, right? Kohen Mashiach, helim dover shel tzibur, seir avoda zara, par shel Yoma Kippurim, and sar shel Yoma Kippur. These are categories of avodas hadam bifnim, inside the heichal, and it's towards the paroches. Now, in the case of par v'sar shel Yom Kippur, it's a little bit more complicated because there's a set of hazos that take place in the Kodesh Kadoshim. But in any event, whether it's the heichal or the Kodesh Kadoshim, these hazos generate a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim. And in order to establish that, we need the extra pasuk lechol, according to Rav. And in the case of mitzorah, we're talking about the asham ha-mitzorah, which is brought after 7 days of Tahara on the 8th day. And he needs to accompany the asham with a lug shemen. And some of this lug shemen has to be sprinkled in the heichal 7 times by the Kohen. So notice that there are 2 categories. One is dam, but it's not on the outer mizbeach. The other is shemen, in the case of mitzorah, and therefore lechol davar. We have 2 ribuyim. The Levi, after all, use the extra pasuk called davar to include an avodah siluk in the case specifically of Trumas Hadeshen. How is he going to derive the hazos? Nafkalemi dvar v'chol dvar. According to Levi, we have 2 separate ribuyim. One is kol, and the other is dvar. Both words are superfluous. One is going to include even an avodah siluk in the case of Trumas Hadeshen. The other is going to include these hazos. V'rav dvar v'chol dvar lo dorish. And again, there are different ways of interpreting this Gemara. Literally, it means that Rav says kol dvar is a phrase that cannot be divided up into its parts, but some of the Mefarshim, which I'm a little bit happy with, because they reinterpret this Gemara to mean not that Rav rejects a ribuy of kol. I mean, all of a shas we have a ribuy of kol, and certainly where davar is extra here. But kol davar means kol, even a hazah of dam, and davar, even hazah of shemen. Now the Gemara accuses Levi of violating one of the basic midos shatar nidreshes by the ema. What happened to the principle called klal prat uklal? We should say lechol dvar mizbeach. Right? Let's open up the pasuk again. It says here lechol dvar mizbeach, and that's a klal. And then it says in the next part of the pasuk, it says avodas matana, and that's a prat. Okay, and we have a principle of klal uprat, ein beklal, mach beprat. In other words, the prat specifies and limits the klal, and therefore the Torah is saying me that when kol dvar limizbeach, that's referring only to an avodas matana. to the exclusion of avodas sila. And the Gemara answers, Omar Kro.